So my name is Jane Woodside. As Valerio has said, I'm Professor of Human Nutrition at Queen's University Belfast, and I have the pleasure of co-chairing this session. Now, unfortunately, one of our speakers, the final speaker in the session, is unable to attend this morning. So we're going to relax the session a little bit. We've told the other two speakers that they can take a little bit more time, and then we will also have more time for discussion, which is obviously good. So, if we can just get everybody to take their seats, we'll get started. I'd also encourage you to be thinking of questions. We obviously want as much discussion as possible. We'll have a short period of time for questions after each individual speaker in this session. But then at the end, we're bringing every speaker back up on stage, and we have an expert panel discussion. This is your opportunity to ask those key questions you've been dying to ask, so keep that in mind. Submit them via the app, or else just raise your hand, and I will do my best in the glare of bright lights to pick you out from the audience. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. So we're shifting very much from nutrients and single nutrients into a focus on dietary patterns. So Darius Mossafarian is a cardiologist. He's the Jean Mayer Professor of Nutrition and Medicine, and he's Dean of the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. Darius, I'm sure you're aware, has been very prolific in terms of scientific publications, and those tend to be in the area of dietary priorities to reduce cardiovascular disease, diabetes and obesity, both in the US and globally, and on evidence-based systems, innovations and policies to effectively reduce these diseases. So we're delighted to have you here, Darius, and look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Buongiorno. Nice to see everybody. It's a pleasure to be here at the EFSA conference. And I'm glad we have a little bit more time because I was asked to talk about nutrients, popular diets, dietary patterns, a range of topics. And my focus is going to be on cardiometabolic diseases, thinking about heart disease, stroke, and obesity. So I think it's fair to say that we face a global nutrition crisis. There's truly a crisis right now, and it's kind of a quiet crisis. We're not really making as much noise about it as we should be, but it's truly a crisis. Poor diet is now the #1 cause of poor health in the world, exceeding any other cause of poor health, whether it's chronic disease, undernutrition, stunting, micronutrient deficiencies. If you put all of those together, this exceeds any other challenge for health. And so if we want to talk about health at all on the planet, human health, we must talk about food. This is also a major issue for disparities, both within countries and across the world. Some of the poorest people on the planet have the worst food and leads to a vicious cycle of poverty. This dramatically increases healthcare costs, and every country in the world is facing rising healthcare costs, including in Europe, the United States, middle-income countries, low-income countries, and much of that healthcare cost is preventable. And I think it's really important to talk not just about health and suffering, but also about cost, because business leaders and businesses respond to concerns about cost, not concerns about human suffering. And so really the cost of this is staggering. Government budgets are being challenged and in some cases decimated by these rising costs. And private business is also being challenged by the costs of health. We're not going to talk today about sustainability and climate change, but if you put together greenhouse gas emissions, water use, deforestation, stress on the oceans, our food is also the single biggest issue for planetary health, for sustainability of the planet. And then even national security, food is a major issue for national security. And it seems like in the modern world we've forgotten about this, but for centuries, it was very important for countries to have well-fed populations for their armies. And in fact, in the United States, the birth of the RDAs in the United States and in Britain at the same time was World War II. Before World War II, both England and the United States said we need to know what the populations need to be healthy. And so President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered a conference called the National Nutrition Conference on Defense that set up the first RDAs. The birth of the school lunch program in the United States, one of the first national school lunch programs, was 1945, because during the World War II, during the draft, many young men who they wanted to draft were undernourished, and so they said we need to have school lunch. So we forget about national security. So if you put all of these things together, health, well-being, disparities, sustainability, budgets, the economy, national security, this is really one of the biggest issues facing the planet. And what's exciting about this is if you compare this to other major issues facing the planet, war, poverty, prejudice, we can actually fix most of this in 10 or 20 years. If you asked me how to fix war or prejudice or poverty in 10 or 20 years, I wouldn't have a lot of answers for you. I'd have some answers, but not a lot. But we can fix most of this problem in the next 10 or 20 years. Now, this is just one slide, one example from the United States, looking at causes of death in 1 year, just as an example. But if you looked at almost any country in the world, it would look similar. This is from the Global Burden of Diseases study. And what it shows is the number of deaths in 1 year in the United States. These are hundreds of thousands of deaths. And the causes of death, the colors are the types of death, and blue is chronic diseases. Chronic diseases predominate as the cause of death in almost every country in the world. And what you can see is in the United States, as in Italy, as in every country in Europe and almost every country in the world, diet has now surpassed tobacco as the #1 cause of poor health. So if we want to think about health, we must think about food. And what's really amazing is at the same time all of the science has shown these problems, the public is now paying attention. So who has noticed, compared to 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, who has noticed the incredible explosion of public attention on food and health, right? We've all noticed this, right? The public is incredibly interested now in how to eat and what it does for their health, especially people under age 20. The young of the world really care about transparency, sustainability, health, where their food comes from. But they're also really confused, and that's what my talk is about a little bit. Why are they so confused? There's so much misinformation out there. There's so many conflicting sources of information. And so this is a challenge, but also an opportunity, because the public is paying attention in a way they've never done before. And just to show you some examples of why the public is confused, these are some of the things that people are focusing on. In low-income countries, policymakers are still focused on single nutrient solutions, on supplements, on biofortification, on vitamin A, animal protein, iron, zinc. More recently, in low-income countries, policymakers are talking about diet diversity, but it's actually not very well defined what that means. So that's what policymakers are focusing on in low-income countries. In middle and high-income countries, policymakers are still mostly focused on the agenda from 30 years ago. Single nutrient targets, single nutrient solutions, total fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, calories, added sugar. Most of those things are not that useful as targets for policy action because they're a single nutrient focus that I'm going to talk about a little more. And what's interesting is the public is focusing on a completely different list. This is my list from the United States. I would guess it's not that different in Europe, in much of Europe. The public is focusing on clean labels, ingredient lists they can understand, whether a food is processed or not, just calling a food processed and trying to define whether it's healthy based on processing, gluten-free, whether it's organic, whether it's local, paleo diets, low-carb diets, vegetarian diets. The public is confused as well. And what's amazing is most of the stuff on this list is not that important, actually. And so, of course, these things are important for the poor, and some of these things are important for the environment. But in terms of the priorities, if you had to set the top 5 or top 10 priorities we should be facing in the world, most of these things wouldn't reach that list. So it is a problem because policy is actively being made focusing on this reductionist focus. By reductionist, I mean trying to break apart foods into their pieces and focus on one piece at a time, right? Instead of talking about the whole food or the whole diet, let's just talk about one nutrient and try to define health based on a single nutrient. And so these are 2 examples. In the United Kingdom, the front-of-pack traffic light label, and in Chile, people probably have heard the new Chile black box warning labels. In both cases, they're very, very focused on single nutrients. In the case of the UK, total calories, total fat, saturated fat, sugars, and salt. In the case of Chile, calories, saturated fat, salt, and sugar. Now, I do think it's reasonable to focus on sugar and salt because those are additives. And so you can take a reductionist approach to additives. You can say we have the same food, you can put more salt in it, you can put less salt in it. We have the same food, you can put more sugar in it, you can put less sugar in it. So for an additive, taking this single nutrient approach may make sense. But for fat, for saturated fat, for calories, it doesn't make any sense to me to focus on those things to define a healthy food. A food can be high in calories and very good for you. It can be low in calories and terrible for you. It can be high in fat and good or bad for you, low in fat or good or bad for you, and high in saturated fat and good or bad for you, or low in saturated fat and good or bad for you. So these three numbers give very little useful information. So this is new policy that's being made now that's really been based on science that's 20 or 30 years old. For obesity, we are focused globally on calories and energy balance. The idea, this is the current conventional wisdom, that all we have to do is count calories. Energy out, energy in, leads to obesity, leads to diabetes. It's just about energy balance. And I think this is a fundamentally flawed concept because it leads people to go and make decisions based on the amount of calories in a food rather than the quality of the food, the actual health impact of that food. I firmly believe, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest, that 600 calories of broccoli is much better for you than 400 calories of soda. And that's an extreme example, but there's lots and lots of other examples where a calorie focus will lead you astray. And so this is also an oversimplification. So how did we get here? Why do we have this single nutrient focus still in policy rather than talking about foods and diet patterns? And these are just a couple of quotes, one from Carl Sagan, the famous scientist. You have to know the past to understand the present, and one from Martin Luther King. We are not makers of history, we are made by history. So I think if we just go back 100 years, we can understand why we are where we are today. And we recently wrote a review on this in the British Medical Journal that I encourage you to look at if you're interested. So it really wasn't that long ago that the first vitamin was discovered. The first vitamin was discovered in the 1920s and the 1930s. The first time a vitamin was isolated and shown to cure or treat a disease was 1932. So less than 100 years ago, 1932, vitamin C was isolated and for the first time in human history proven to prevent or cure a disease, which in this case was scurvy. And in 1932, that was shown, and in the next 10 or 20 years, there was an explosion of science identifying vitamins, isolating vitamins, showing that they cured and caused diseases like beriberi and pellagra and rickets. So this single nutrient focus was the major focus, and in rapid succession, all of the known vitamins were isolated and synthesized. Now, what happened at the same time, I've mentioned before, was the Great Depression, which was worldwide, and World War II. And so that led to huge concern about food shortages and food insecurity and lack of food. So all of the geopolitical and scientific forces combined to focus on nutrient deficiencies. And that led to this idea of recommended daily allowances, as I mentioned, which really were born from World War II. How do we get enough food to the population? So that led to this concept of food as a delivery system. We need food to deliver specific isolated nutrients, this reductionist focus. And it led to early discussions of fat versus sugar. Well, what happened over the next 20 or 30 years was an expansion of this focus, really thinking about food as a delivery system, changing nutrition policy and agricultural technology to increase the amount of food and fortify it and deliver these essential nutrients to the population. In developing countries, there was a huge battle over whether malnutrition was due to protein deficiency or calorie deficiency. It was a big battle. Ultimately, the science decided that it was really calorie deficiency was the major problem, not protein deficiency. But what happened in the meantime is there was an explosion over this 10 or 20 years of debate of industry-fortified protein foods for kids, infant formulas, fortified foods that were to compete with other natural foods in the developing world. It was really done purposefully because there was concern about protein. They were trying to get protein and vitamins to kids. So this focus really dominated early nutrition history from 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940, 1950, 1960. For 50 years, we focused on single nutrients. And it really wasn't until around 1980 that there started to be attention to chronic disease, obesity, cancer, cardiovascular disease, significant research attention. And so what happened, the mistake, was in 1980 was taking that reductionist focus where we focus on single nutrients one at a time and extending it to chronic disease. For preventing scurvy, it makes sense to focus on vitamin C. For preventing rickets, it makes sense to focus on vitamin D. For preventing heart disease, it does not make sense to focus on saturated fat as a sole target. For preventing obesity, it does not make sense to focus on calories as a sole target. The reductionist focus works well for deficiency diseases. It works terribly for chronic diseases, which are complicated. And so that's really why we are where we are today, is we've just naturally and mistakenly extended what worked for 50 years, and we're trying to apply it to chronic disease. So the reason I'm optimistic is this explosion of nutrition science, which has happened on nutrition and chronic disease, is helping to lead us, I think, in the right direction. This is a chart of scientific publications on diet and cardiovascular disease, diet and diabetes, and diet and obesity in every decade from 1960. And you can see that every decade the science has doubled. And this is just the first 5 years of this current decade, and so we're on pace to double the science again. Most of what we know about diet and diabetes and diet and cardiovascular disease and diet and obesity has been published after 2000. The majority of the science has been published after 2000, and yet the policy is still focused on the science, the limited science that was published before 2000. This is just one summary of, I think, what we've learned over the last 20 years. This is the summary of the two of the largest trials ever performed looking at diet and cardiovascular disease. The top is the Women's Health Initiative, 50,000 women, postmenopausal women, who were randomized to a low-fat diet and also lowered their cholesterol and lowered their saturated fat. And the Predimed trial, as you know, in Spain, which randomized about 8,000 Spaniards to a Mediterranean diet. The Women's Health Initiative focused on lowering fat. They lowered fat substantially, 8% energy less fat, and on lowering saturated fat, about 3% less energy in saturated fat, which is a huge reduction. And as you can see, there was absolutely no difference. This is the cumulative hazard of cardiovascular disease. There was absolutely no difference in cardiovascular disease. So they followed the guidelines. They met the guidelines for a low-fat diet and a low-saturated fat diet and low dietary cholesterol. Zero change in cardiovascular disease. The Predimed trial had no nutrient target whatsoever. It didn't have a single nutrient target. It didn't say anything about percent calories from nutrient X or nutrient Y or nutrient Z. It talked about foods and food quality. It encouraged more consumption of healthy foods. Eat more nuts, eat more extra virgin olive oil, eat more fruits, eat more vegetables, eat more beans, eat more fish. Those are the major guidelines. And they actually increased fat intake in the two intervention arms, a Mediterranean diet plus nuts and a Mediterranean diet plus extra virgin olive oil. They increased the percent energy from saturated fat to about 42% of energy, well above the current Institute of Medicine guidelines. Over 40% of calories from fat, and there was no change at all in saturated fat. And yet, look what happened. There was a 30% reduction in death, heart attacks, and stroke. So these two trials really, I think, provide clear examples of what we did wrong and what we need to do right. When we focus on fat and saturated fat, nothing happens. It's not bad, it's not good, because you can have a very healthy diet, low in fat, low in saturated fat. You can have a terrible diet, low in fat and low in saturated fat. So it's really not meaningful to focus on those things. When you focus on healthy foods, especially healthy fats, you reduce risk. And actually, while they were giving them more fats from nuts and extra virgin olive oil, they had no weight gain, and in fact, they lost waist circumference. Their waist circumference was lower, even though they were eating more healthy fats. So I think here's the lessons we've learned. I have 4 lessons that I want to share with you. I think what we've learned over the last 20 or 30 years. First, we have to move away from single nutrients, and we have to focus on foods and food patterns. It's really about foods and food patterns. The second lesson is that there's good foods to eat. We've been focused too long on negative aspects of the diet. So this is my graph of what I think we know, and of course it's not perfect, but it's my best interpretation of the evidence. I think that there's foods that are good for us, there's foods that are neutral, and there's foods and additives that are harmful for us. And so we need to maximize the good. We need to encourage much more of the good. And that's a positive message. That's a positive message for EFSA. It's a positive message for industry. It's a positive message for doctors, for the public, for nutritionists. We need to eat more of this stuff. And you won't gain weight. You eat more of these foods, you'll actually maintain a healthy weight. Fruits, nuts, fish, vegetables, plant oils, whole grains, beans, and yogurt. We need to eat more of these foods. There's a bunch of foods that are kind of neutral, and neutral is okay. We can't always be eating the healthiest thing in the food supply, but they're mostly neutral. Cheese may be a little bit better than neutral. Cheese is linked to low risk of diabetes pretty consistently, and it may relate to fermentation and active bacterial cultures. We need to understand that. Unprocessed red meats, a little bit bad, again, linked to higher risk of diabetes, and it's not the fat, it's not the saturated fat, it's probably the heme iron. If we eat too much heme iron, that increases diabetes risk. But this is mostly neutral foods, and the worst things in the food supply are the starch, the refined grain starches and sugars, processed meats, high sodium foods, and industrial trans fat. As I mentioned before, most of the things on this list are foods, not nutrients. The exceptions are additives, so I do think for additives like industrial trans fat, sodium, and added sugar, it does make sense to focus on an additive as a reductionist focus because you can add that to or take it away from the same food or the same diet pattern. But with the exception of additives, we really should be talking about foods. Lesson number 2, what I think we've learned is that we have to stop thinking about one health problem at a time. So in the 1960s and 1970s, we were really focused on blood lipids and blood cholesterol, and that's what led to the low-fat diet. Right? The low-fat diet was recommended globally because of concern about cholesterol and heart disease. Now, we're completely infatuated and focused on obesity, leading to low-calorie recommendations, counting calories, energy balance, portion size. We're forgetting that food affects every pathway related to health beyond obesity and beyond lipids. It affects blood pressure, glucose, the liver, inflammation, brain reward, the microbiome, and on and on and on. So we can't make decisions about just obesity or just lipids. Obesity is actually a minor pathway by which diet affects health. If you're obese and you have a very healthy diet, you dramatically lower your risk. If you're lean and you have a bad diet, you dramatically raise your risk, much for cardiovascular disease and stroke in particular. For type 2 diabetes, of course, obesity is a huge risk factor, but for cardiovascular disease and stroke, it's really about these other risk factors. So we have to stop looking one risk factor at a time and think globally about health effects. Lesson number 3, I've mentioned this a couple times, when it comes to obesity, we have to stop focusing on calories alone. Now, if you're going to eat bad foods, if you're going to have soda, if you're going to have candy, if you're going to have, French fries, and it's mostly the potatoes that are bad for you, not the oil, then of course you should count calories and have less. If you're going to have bad foods, you should have less of bad foods. But if you're going to have healthy foods, you should eat more healthy foods. You should liberally use oils in cooking, liberally use plant oils. Eat all the fruit you want. Eat all the nuts that you want. All the evidence suggests those things are good for us. And so we have to really think about foods in terms of their complexity of effects. Counting calories to focus on obesity is very oversimplified. It's like saying that human beings are buckets, and there's a hole at the top, and you pour calories in the top, and there's a hole in the bottom, and calories come out the bottom, and that's all that matters, right? That's not true. We are complex biologic organisms, and the foods that we eat affect our brains, affect our livers, affect our fat cells, affect our microbiome, affect our glucose and insulin, and those are the things that lead to weight gain or not weight gain in the long term. So it's not just about calories. How can I advance? And I'll just give you some examples. I gave you the example of broccoli versus soda. That's sort of an obvious example, but there's lots of other examples. Chocolate skim milk is a great example. In the United States, whole milk is banned from public schools. You cannot buy whole milk in schools. But you can buy chocolate, sugar-sweetened skim milk because it has fewer calories and it has lower saturated fat, right? So that shows how smart people who are trying to do the right thing make the wrong decision when they focused on calories. In the United States, low-fat and fat-free salad dressing is very common. It's probably not common yet in Italy, but I guess if you go to England, if you go to Germany, if you go to northern France, I bet people are using low-fat or fat-free salad dressing, right? Salad dressing, by definition, should be oil. And by definition, the oil should be good for you. So what's in fat-free salad dressing? Has anybody stopped to think what in the heck is in fat-free salad dressing? It's just starch, sugar, and salt, right? So we're replacing healthy oils with starch, sugar, and salt to get fewer calories. There's many, many examples. Baked potato chips is my other favorite example, right? In a potato chips, there's 3 ingredients: salt, starch from potatoes, and oil. The oil is good for you. It's soybean oil or canola oil. Trans fat's almost been eliminated from potato chips globally. So the oil's good for you. So I don't think potatoes are a health food, but if you're going to eat potato chips, get the highest fat version you can, because at least you're getting the healthy fat with the starch and the salt. And then lesson number 4 that I want to spend the last few minutes on that we've learned, I think, is that if we want to change this, it's not about individual education. It's not about just telling people what to eat. We have to have policy change and systems change to improve people's diets. We can't pretend that it's an individual choice what to eat. All of us here today are relatively wealthy in the world. We have free choice. Yet at this break, the break we were just at, you only had the choices of what to eat of what was there, right? And if you think of the poor people in the world and their choices, right, this isn't about free will. This is about the systems that we have around us. This is about the socio-cultural influences, the community and environment influences, agriculture, industry, marketing influences, governmental influences, global influences. There's so many influences on our choices. And, this reminds me of many examples, but nutrition is the only example I can think of in our economy where we leave safety up to the individual. Imagine if for toys, you told parents, most toys in the toy store are dangerous. They're mostly bad for your kids, and you have to figure it out which are safe and which are dangerous. Go to the toy store and try to figure out, read the labels, and pick the toys that are safe for your kids. They're a little bit more expensive. They're hard to find, but they're there, right? We would never do that. Imagine if we did that for cars. We said most cars we know are dangerous and are causing deaths, but we'll leave it up to you to choose. We don't do that for almost anything in our economy except for food. We know 70-80% of foods in the food supply are actually probably not that good for us, and we're not doing enough about it. So this is our list, our summary of where I think the best policies and systems changes are to make a difference. No single solution is going to make a difference. If we lower sodium alone, as the UK has done, that's incredibly important, but by itself, it's not going to have a massive impact. If we tax soda and tax junk food like Mexico has done, that's important, but by itself, it's not going to prevent obesity in Mexico. We have to do multiple things. This is a complicated system, and so these are our recommendations. We need to focus on more research and innovation to understand things like the microbiome and flavanols and how to use big data, how to have public-private partnerships. We need to integrate nutrition into healthcare. We need nutrition in the electronic health record, in medical education. Insurance should pay for fruit and vegetable prescriptions. There are programs now in the United States where you can go to your doctor, you get a prescription for a fruit and vegetable, and the insurance pays for 30% of the fruits and vegetables, right? That needs to be expanded in the United States and elsewhere. Many, many other things. Economic incentives work. That's probably the single most important thing that a government can do, is change the economic incentives for food by taxing things like sugar-sweetened beverages and added sugar and salt, but using the revenues to make healthy food less expensive. If you tax sugar-sweetened beverages and you tax added sugar and you tax junk food, and you just take that money and spend it on something else, that's harmful to the poor from a financial perspective. If you use that money to subsidize healthier foods, you get double the bang for your buck. We need to use schools, we need to use worksite wellness, and we need to use standards and labeling. So I just want to end with a question about food industry. People always ask me, well, what's the role of food industry here? Are they just like big tobacco, right? And people have said, this is a picture of French fries in a box, and this is what you see when you go to the grocery store, right? Is big food just like big tobacco? I think that they use a lot of the same tactics. So there's denial, there's fighting the science, there's attacking the scientists, there's lobbying. There's a lot of the same tactics. But at the end of the day, I don't think food is like tobacco. The reason I don't think food is like tobacco is with tobacco, there's one product, and it's a fight to the death. We want to eliminate it, right? We want to eliminate tobacco. With food, we need food industry to help us make healthier food. And if they can make a profit making healthier food, they're delighted to do so. Why wouldn't they? They're happy to make a profit selling healthier food. And when I say industry, I mean agriculture, restaurants, supermarkets, and food manufacturers. So I think a better example than tobacco for me is cars. If we think about cars, we've made cars much, much safer in the last 100 years, and industry has played a role in that. And so this is a graph from the United States of deaths per million vehicle miles traveled in the United States from 1925 to 1995. This is deaths per mile traveled by car. There was a 90% reduction in the last century in deaths per mile traveled by car. And I'm sure if you look in Europe, it'll look the same. A huge public health success. So how did we do this? How did we make cars safer? Did we just educate people and every 5 years put out new guidelines about driving and put labels on the car, stickers on the car, and say this car is safe, this car is not safe, and just leave it up to the driver? No, of course we didn't. There was a multi-component approach that it did address the driver, but more it addressed the car, it addressed the road, and it addressed the culture, especially around drunk driving. Lots and lots of things were done to the car. Active protections, passive protections, safety standards, safety inspections, lots of things were done to the car. Lots of things were done to the road. Road engineering, guardrails, speed limits, and so forth. And a huge amount of effort was spent around the culture of driving, especially drinking. Very little, I would say, was done to the driver. I think the driver today is not that different from the driver from 50 or 60 years ago, right? Cars are safer not because we address the driver, but because we address the car, the road, and the culture. This is the roadmap for food. We have to address the consumer. It's true. We do have to address the consumer a little bit. But more, we have to address the product. We have to address the environment, all the cafeterias, the grocery stores, the food manufacturers, the farms. And we have to address the culture around unhealthy eating. So choosing an unhealthy food is no longer culturally okay. So I think that's the roadmap to the future. I think that's what we've learned. So in terms of next directions, I just want to end here. I think that the future of nutrition science in the next 10 years is going to be understanding the complexity I talked about, the microbiome, fermented foods, specific flavonoids, fatty acids, the influences of social status. For obesity, we need to understand quality is more important than quantity. We have to focus on diet quality, not quantity. We have to do much more research to understand the effects of processing and additives. We can't just say processing food is bad. That can't be true. There has to be optimal processing and suboptimal processing. We really have to understand how to process foods and make them healthy. We have to understand the way diet affects not just obesity and lipids, but a whole range of important pathways. And we have to really focus on the science of public health, how we unite these scientific advances and translate them into policy. So thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions.
So thank you very much, Darius. Very comprehensive presentation. I'm sure there will be some questions from the floor. So anybody have a burning question? Maybe, yeah.
Yes, I also wrote it, but I wanted to know, EFSA claims, approved EFSA claims, induce people to think that if the product has low fat, it's healthy. EFSA approves a claim just for one nutrient. So this kind of communication allow people to think that just one nutrient can make the product healthy. So don't you think that we have to rethink EFSA claims and say that a claim is permitted only if a product has more nutritional factors that can help the reducing of the risk.
Yeah, so the question was at EFSA, a product just being low fat is considered potentially healthy. I would argue that many low-fat products are actually not that healthy, and high-fat products, nuts, products that have high amounts of nuts or plant oils are very good for us, and so we should eliminate fat completely as a criteria, high or low. And the FDA has started to take action. So I don't know if people know this, but do people know Kind bars? Kind are the nut-rich snack bars you see in the airports. Do people know Kind? The Kind company? So about 2 years ago, Kind bars got a violation letter from FDA because they were marketing their bars as healthy. They're mostly nuts with a little bit of coconut, a little bit of chocolate, a little bit of sugar. If you're going to get a healthy bar in an airport, Kind bars are a pretty decent choice. And they got a violation letter from FDA saying you can't market your bars as healthy because they're too high in fat. And Kind wrote a petition, said the fat's from nuts. It's all unsaturated fats, mostly. It has a little bit of saturated fat, but mostly unsaturated fat. The dietary guidelines say to eat nuts. Your criteria about low fat was based on a rule that was written in 1980. Don't you think you should update it? And to FDA's credit, they said, you're right, we should update it. So they actually withdrew the violation letter, which is incredible to me, and they said that Kind can continue to market their bars as healthy, and the FDA right now is updating their definition of healthy and taking public comments on what that should be. And I think fat should be just removed entirely from the definition of what's healthy or not healthy. So I agree with you, yeah.
Can I just ask, you have a very comprehensive roadmap of policy approaches. To what extent do you think policymakers are following that roadmap, or are they on the path to adopting some of those approaches, and maybe in the US and then perhaps globally?
Yeah, well, so I think it's exciting that policymakers are starting to pay attention. So, I don't want to criticize the people in the UK or Chile or in other places that are doing these things because they're trying to do the right thing and they want to do the right thing. And so policymakers are paying attention. And of course, that attention is mixed and heterogeneous. It's higher and lower in some places than others. So to me, I'm not worried about policy action happening. It's going to happen because it's not sustainable. We can't have obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, stroke at the rates that we're having them. So what I'm worried about is that the policies won't be evidence-based. So I'm more concerned about the policies being evidence-based than lack of policy. I'd rather have no policy than have a policy that's not evidence-based and can be distracting or even harmful. So, but I think it's really important for us, everyone in the room, to be sure policymakers are paying attention and taking action. And we're working very hard to see if we can get the federal government in the United States to pay attention. States are paying attention, cities are paying attention, but the federal government so far hasn't. So we've made some progress in the last year, and there are now bills and discussions and briefings in Washington, D.C. on food. And the theme that we're talking about is food is medicine. Food is medicine, meaning that food is the ultimate treatment for health. And so we're really talking about food as medicine with the Congress, and we're getting good responses.
Okay. Any further questions? Yes?
Graham McGregor's asking me a question. I have to get ready.
Very dangerous, yeah. I agree with you that food quality is very important. What I don't see is 70% of the food we now eat is unhealthy based on what criteria like. And that's the one that's marketed, promoted, and sold by the food industry because it's very profitable. What I don't see from your position is how you're going to stop those foods being consumed because they're much cheaper. How are you going to change them? And I think the missing thing in your talk is what you need to do, in my view, is obviously promote complex dietary foods. I agree with that. But you need to slowly change those unhealthy foods to make them more healthy because you can't ban them. You can't suddenly say to the food industry, that's unhealthy, sorry, we're banning it. So what are you actually going to do with those foods? That's what I'd like to hear.
Yeah, so I think that, the chart that I showed of the policy and systems changes all addresses that. And so you address it through the healthcare system, you address it through schools, you address it through work sites, you address it through quality and labeling standards, and you address it through economic incentives and disincentives so that there are economic incentives for marketing and selling and developing healthier foods, economic disincentives for doing that in unhealthier foods. If you combine the power of schools, the power of work sites, the power of economic incentives, better and continued research and quality and labeling standards that make sense and are updated, together all of that will work. We also have to change the consumer demand, and so I don't think we can ignore consumer demand. And so, continuing to have guidelines and education and updating those is also important. But I think that's a smaller effect. I think really consumers will eat what's there and what's culturally acceptable and what the sports stars are marketing and what's on the box with the cartoons. So I think that, again, it wasn't the main focus of my talk, Graham, but I think that everything I outlined is exactly to address the problem that you're saying, that you're outlining.
Okay, thank you. There are some interesting questions coming through on the app, but I think it would be better to have them as part of panel discussions, so we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Darius. So I'd like to invite our next speaker to the podium. So Dr. Petra Klassen-Vigger she's held a number of different positions in Nestle, for example, at Nestle Research Center, and then as Medical and Scientific Affairs Manager at the Nestle Nutrition Institute. She's currently heading the Global Nutrition, Health and Wellness Unit at Nestle Research in Lausanne, Switzerland. And she's going to talk to us today about food innovation and consumer trends and the impact on food consumption and dietary pattern. Petra, thank you.
So, yes, hello everybody. I'm not as tall as the previous male speakers, but I still try to speak loud and clear, I hope. And as you can see from the title, I mean, it's a super fast topic that I was kindly invited to present on. And I think I give a few thoughts here to also stimulate some of the discussion that we may have, because it's such a vast topic. You can have probably a week conference on that alone, and you would not be really missing or getting bored. So what I would like to start off with is actually, sharing a little bit on the global socio-demographic trends, which we will see there is a lot of consistency in messaging from speakers previously. But what I would like to do is to set them in the context of, the food demand and the people that eventually really create and provide foods. Then I will talk a little bit about opportunities and challenges for healthy dietary pattern that arise out of consumer trends that I would have honed in a little bit more. I will show a few solutions and impacts, but rather really also to give examples, because it's so exhaustive that you cannot touch upon this in 20-25 minutes, and then a few conclusions from my side. So socio-demographic trends we have been seeing quite a bit already from our previous speakers. I would just like again to put that into context of the food demand side, because how do they impact? So population growth is something that definitely impacts the food shortage, but also nutrition unbalances. And I think it's a major public health concern. There is no doubt about it. And the coexistence makes it even harder to actually tackle that. I mean, Darius was, I think, alluding to this. And personally, I find it quite worrying also that we see for the first time in a few years now increase also in undernutrition. So the issues coexist, and how to really tackle them all together, I think is a major challenge. And there is huge complexity around that. And none of that, I think, deserves to be actually kind of forgotten and neglected. But solutions need to tackle the range really coming from undernutrition to overweight, obesity, and also the qualitative undernutrition, which relates, for example, to micronutrient deficiencies. Another big topic is actually urbanization, which is actually challenging the supply chain. If you see in many parts of the world, people are basically fleeing the rural sites, and they're going into cities because they want to make a better living there, because they can't necessarily survive. And that all really is also kind of influencing how we actually will have foods available that will nourish us. Then we have, in many parts of the world, aging population and their related health concerns. We heard a lot about that previously, which also will probably, impact on how we can personalize diets to avoid that actually people, they come into frailty and independence, and how you can prolong that. Graham McGregor was alluding also to that, how can we prevent and add more life to years in a way. healthy life to years, because we get all older, but we are not necessarily getting older healthier until the end. So there are big challenges coming with that as well. Then you have poverty versus super rich. So I think inequality is a topic that we haven't really heard a lot about, and I will not have the time also to focus a lot of it. But we must be very clear that this actually makes a strong voice for the importance of affordable products. And here again, of course, there is this kind of huge challenge, like in the current context of the world, how can we nourish people by not considering only providing calories, but also really nourishing with a balanced diet and in an affordable way that actually is manageable for all parties in the play. And then a last huge part is actually information and the digitalization of things, which touches upon the technical part or technological advances. I mean, nobody is spared out in the room. I suppose that, like if you have gone, and I see a few people that have been probably in conferences 10, 20 years ago, and there was probably no Q&A through an app. So that's only a few years ago. Today, I would say in the room, nobody is discriminated for not being able to use that, because you probably all have mobile phones. And so this is massively influencing the way that actually also consumers are behaving. And I would also just raise one point here, what we see from the consumer side of things. Yes, we have an overwhelming amount of information, but what is the information you get channeled to as well? If you start, I saw that some people are using that also, follow me on Twitter, and you choose who to follow on Twitter or any social media. But that actually then you get suggestions building on your likes and building on your personal values and beliefs, and consequently you hear more of what you like to hear. So I think that is also something that we should also remember, that actually in terms of the communication that comes our way, we make choices actually to see, and people make these choices, and who they want to listen to, who they get influenced by. And I think it's something that specifically in this audience with so tremendous amount of scientists, is something that also we need to consider, how you can actually also contribute to make a positive impact on these communications to the consumers. So we basically see that consumers have been evolving, and that is probably true throughout mankind. Yet, to give it a bit more of a focus here, I think, and it again reflects also, and that's I think the very positive note, what we see in terms of the nutritional sciences, we also see happening and reflected in what consumers are pursuing. They are moving away from only the public health sensitive nutrients or the more negative messaging, and wanting to see also some positive messages. I mean, that we see a trend in high protein, given the morning's discussion, probably is not very surprising, because, if there's so much emphasis on sugar, on fat, I mean, what is left in terms of macronutrients? However, what we do see also is that the consumers are moving away from single nutrients also and going into food groups and dietary pattern, which I think is, again, a good starting point to build upon, because there is readiness and willingness actually to move into this direction. And you see even trends emerging, such as common sense nutrition, which I think gives room really also to build upon what was actually previous speakers suggesting, that we have to move out from just, like a very unilateral view into a more complex view. What we also see is that they move from the basic nutrients into more functional benefits. So gut health is a big topic. Across the world, you see probably an increase again in fermented foods, in prebiotics and probiotics, and whatever manifestations these kind of trends have. You see huge trend on the microbiome research as well, in terms of the research investments that goes there. So we always can see a bit of a connect as well, that spills over into the consumer world as well. And beyond actually, and I think Dariusz also touched a little bit about that, it's not just our physical body immediately, which we connect into, like, okay, this gives me muscle strength or this, that, or the other. They also want to see more functional benefits, for example, as it relates to alertness, to energy. And I show a bit data also which demonstrate why this is. I mean, people seeking for remedies, because this is a world where even the young ones, they are pretty much stressed, and they want to make sure that food can help them actually to manage that. Right or wrong is another discussion, but these are kind of things that we see coming out from the consumer research data. Then the other part is actually that consumers are basically taking a bit more their lives in their own hand by, I think what may be right for me, to actually moving, I know what's right for me. I think, again, is this a substantiated view from an academic standpoint? But that is actually what the consumer perception is kind of suggesting here. And that people are, they made decisions on gluten-free by not being a celiac patient. Or they may have chosen lactose-free without really understanding if they truly are lactose intolerant. But they made these choices based on who they were influenced. So if you have, for example, a sports person saying that, since I'm on a gluten-free diet, I play much better tennis, this has an effect. And people think that, this performance and stuff like this has something to do with a gluten-free diet, hence they may choose to go on a gluten-free diet. If they don't see immediate negative consequences, they may stick with it. They may as well move on something else that comes across along their way. Then we can see also a wide range of diets. As said previously, like what to choose from, vegan diet, ketogenic diet, paleo diet, I mean, you name it. It's all out there, and we see a lot of attraction also for people moving into this. And then a huge topic is the personalized nutrition that we see emerging. So I also would like this is not an exhaustive picture, just to give you a few examples of what's out there in the world, how people really are basically now enabled to manage, and that they can choose to take a proactive approach, because there are now test kits that you can order at home, you can analyze your microbiome, and you can then make a decision of what diet you should follow. Now, again, what is the substantiation or evidence behind if that personal diet, delivers you better health or makes you happier, or whatever your objective is in terms of testing your microbiome is a different discussion, but these tools are out there. Then you can also have actually here a personalized nutrition. There are companies that sell DNA tests, and then you get like a sort of a high-level metabolic profiling, and then finally you can actually get advice on what you should be eating according to your DNA setup, etc. Or, there is a recent one that also in terms of your supplementation, there is a test where you can actually kind of even identify what should be your omega-3s that you should be consuming. Again, the evidence from a scientific perspective of, like how individually decisions are supported by evidence is not the point that I'm going to make here, but it's more that these things are out and the consumer's going ahead and they actually using what is available there. I want to now hone in on a few trends that I believe are quite large and also, I think, likely to stay. And here, for example, we have data from Europe where we have the trend toward plant-based diets. You can see across, actually, the answers in terms of I'm a vegetarian or I'm a vegan are both above, above, 10% almost now everywhere, which is quite interesting to see. The other point I would like to make is actually the influence of the generations. So you can see here that actually the younger ages, they are specifically interested in actually moving into vegan and vegetarian diets. So staying a moment here with the generations, and do generations influence the choices? I think there are really quite a lot of evidence where we can see that the millennials specifically, that are those born between 1980 and 2000, they actually have been influencing quite significantly. They were the generation that are connected all the time. So there are data studies shown that a millennial basically checks their phones 43 times on average a day. Well, what do they do there? Yes, there is a lot going on in terms of probably music, entertainment, etc. But there is also more and more coming apps in that may lead into managing diets, managing my health, etc. interesting with this category and why we believe they also do influence quite a lot is because they want to spend their money on food. Even if they have less income, because they are not necessarily the workaholics that their parents were used to be, they still want to spend it on food and on good food. Nevertheless, they also, of course, want to have the convenience of the food, and they actually pay for value, and in value in terms of the beliefs. So I have a certain belief, and my values should be represented in the foods that I am purchasing. And also they have a priority in their life is actually expressed as good health. So this is something they consider. However, if we look at the next upcoming generations, which are quite a bit young these days, for still taking a lot of, purchase decisions today, they start already to evolve slightly differently than what the core millennials were doing. So to the question when they say, does technology save the world, you have roughly 80% of millennials that answered, yes, it will save the world, and you have less than 70% of these youngsters that actually still think that this will save the world, but more people saying it may kill the world. So I think there are really kind of different expressions, and so also what we see is that while millennials, they gave away for free all the information willingly, no, I am a transparent person, take all the information from me. The Gen Z seem to be understanding that privacy is a currency, and it becomes a higher intention. So all of that, of course, is a dynamic process, and I think it's super interesting to see how that actually influences and will continue to influence the things that we're going to do as it relates to nutrition and health. So moving on, I also saw that in previous slides. I think here I just want to emphasize again that it's not really about just, describing a product or a food item. There is a connection into actually what you eat to where you live and to actually what it does to our planet. So in that context also, we see that there is a big trend on natural. I'm going to speak a little bit about that because it's huge, and you can ask what does it mean. What it means, we saw a little bit, Darius was mentioned that people are wanting to have more clean recipes. What does it mean? So for example, for a food culinary product, it basically means what I have in my kitchen cupboard, I may want to see also in my food. This is the one angle that this clean recipes is taken. And that, again, I'm just insisting because we're at EFSA here, this has nothing to do with food safety. And the question was raised yesterday also in the opening session that, it's not the question about is the food safe or not. It's more about the perception, do I want it in my food or not? That is in here. So then there is a natural ingredients. Again, I think from a food safety perspective, it doesn't mean that a natural food makes it a safe food, right? I mean, I don't need to talk to that audience in that regard, but it is a tendency, of course, that natural ingredients is a desire for a lot of young people that want to do that. In that context, we see also trends into moving into more local food, so locally grown. Again, data to demonstrate is that a better option or a less good option is a different discussion. This is really just what consumers are expressing and what they would like to do. They still want to keep the convenience, yet they also are really the ones that, self-portray. Food is for them a way to express their own values. So they photograph and then they put it on Instagram. So we see also there is a notion of, if you want to provide something to millennials, it better looks good as well. Yet when it comes to the next generation, Gen Z, they basically say, appreciate your food, eat your food, but stop photographing it. So there is even trends now that they say, put your phone away during lunch or dinner, because here is the offline. And they actually go moving from the millennials, they had the fear of missing out, the FOMO, into the JOMO, which is the joy of missing out. So it's a choice actually to not be connected. So very interesting influence of the technology on many, many parts of the world, going way beyond also, of course, the nutrition itself. And then lastly, as I said, it also goes into the society. I mean, the influence on the community and on the planet is quite important. And actually, I think what we also see in terms of communication aspect, it has to be an engagement. There is no talking to, it's actually engaging with the consumer in a dialogue, more and more. So what drives food purchases? I think we need to remember, or just remind ourselves, that huge drivers for purchase remain price and taste and convenience. They are still huge. On the positive side for this audience, I think the good news is that consumers are valuing health and wellness, safety, social impact, and experience, and that was actually done in a survey by Deloitte. I think the mix of that is quite interesting. What I think is also interesting is that there were the consumers who were more on this scheme of the things, were more likely to actually use social media, digital sources and want to acquire information about the products that were also driven by these elements for a food purchase. So moving on to opportunities and challenges, I again just raise a few topics which I believe they are just a representative of what we see out there in terms of data. Again, the big trend on vegetarian and natural is interlinked, because here also the preference for natural will also drive towards vegetarian and vegan and plant-based formulation. And that in itself then also, that consumers will prioritize fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grain, and botanicals. Well, great news. The public health community is also desiring that, and I think this is where also, I guess it's an exciting moment in time that consumers really are looking forward to that. So what does it mean? I think these consumer trends, they can certainly reinforce, and I just took that for sakes of illustration, they can reinforce part of our dietary guidelines, which are moving more and more into food groups. Yet, we need to be cautious actually also in terms of certain nutrients which we know are difficult to manage, specifically going on a vegan diet, like vitamin B12 may be something you need to watch out how you will meet your dietary requirements. And there is, for example, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics in the US that has actually taken a position statement, calling these specifically out. Now, there is a divergence of the consumer demand and nutritional recommendations, however, as well, and to also the scientific literature. There is a trend toward these superfoods that basically they have a perception of just doing any good, and again, what's the level of evidence that reaches consumers is a second discussion. So here, for example, this is only just really for what you find when you search the internet. You'll find many other sources of information, like the benefits of coconut oil going from boost your immunity, about your hair, weight loss, you name it. And then you have at the same time academia saying coconut oil, here this is from the British Nutrition Foundation, a nutty idea. So there is also dialogue to have to basically understand, okay, let's acknowledge we don't know everything, but with the knowledge we have, what's the best advice we can give, and then also influence that we can, help consumers making the choices that we think are the ones toward a balanced diet. Now, I want to touch a little bit about communication. It's really quite interesting because I was looking at the tweets this morning from the other rooms, and there was a presentation that said that if you put a low in claim, this food is perceived as healthy. Hoo, hooray. Well, if that's your objective, fine. But if the objective is that the food is still eaten, probably you need to look at other data additionally. Because here we see, for example, that if you have low-fat labeling on a snack food, it may increase the calorie intake because you have a guilt-free notion, and then you may overcompensate. So again, what is it that we want to communicate in terms of to the consumer with the claims that are available? Then consumers, they may charge, there are studies showing that consumers choose larger portion for semi-skim milk. And also if you have things such as diet and fiber, you may again increase the consumption because you think it's good for you. So I think just for us to think about, the communication is super complex, and it may also trigger what we would like to see, but it may also have other unintended effects when we look at this. Then, as I said, the association with liking, the consumers tend to reject sugar-reduced products because it actually is considered as healthier, but it may not satisfy their sensory or hedonic expectations. So in a way, if we if we simplify that a little bit, we could say that healthy snack foods, they are less in sugar or less in salt, they are consequently less tasty, and so I reject the food. And this is something as well where I think as academicians or as scientists, I also think we are challenged to see how can you turn this into what is your desired outcome. If you would like the foods to be consumed, how do we do that in a positive and an engaging way so that it delights at the end also the people that really need to consume. I want to touch again very slightly about behavioral barriers because I think that we have a lot of things in the toolbox, yet we need to also understand, like what are the challenges that go beyond providing healthy foods. And there are a lot of behavioral barriers. And what I think has been not yet touched upon a lot was actually, that it's hard, that consumers express, it's hard for me to change. I don't know really how to do it and adhere to it. And then another important one is actually skills. People may have lost to forget how you cook with lentils, how you cook with chickpeas, and all these nice things around there. So the skills and providing actually healthy recipes that include the food groups that we would like people to consume more of is another element that we need to think about. And then I pointed out before, it's actually, there is this perception, that healthy food doesn't taste good. So that is something as well that we need to work on to really make sure that healthy foods becomes a delightful food. And then eating healthy is too expensive. We heard that from previous speakers. It's also the perception that the consumers have, that they can't necessarily perceive that they would have the means to buy a healthy food basket. So solutions. So there is a lot, and I'm not going to talk through the entire slide here because of the interest of time, but as it also relates to people working in food industry and on the food demand side, there's a lot of research that we need to do in context of these trends that we see. So for example, if it comes to affordable micronutrients, Darius was mentioning to biofortification, but we are far, far, far behind in actually scaling biofortified solutions into the population so far. I could spend another hour talking on that, but we don't have time for that. We also need to consider then that we have also solutions that remain bioavailable, that are stable also when people process their own food, even if processing is not done by food industry, you process food at home as well. So it needs to be stable there as well. So these are just a few things. As it relates to authentics and questions of proximity, you must be sure that you have also the tools in place to really demonstrate that your food truly is authentic. And there are different technologies that can work with that. Then, of course, we need to understand that also what we provide, definitely as a food manufacturer, it's our basis that the food that we provide has to be safe on the standards that are set out there overall at a given product level. And so then we need also, as it relates to low sugar, sodium, fat, again, what does it mean to make that also taste what I was showing before, why that is the case. Then also superfood ingredients, we need to also demonstrate, do these superfoods truly have the benefits that the consumers are perceiving to have, etc. Somebody suggested that was hoping or thinking, I don't know, that I would show something on sugar, but I thought sugar and fat was already covered, so I take an example of sodium here. And yes, reformulation, I think for me, it's almost like a given. And across the food industry, we see efforts in actually removing the public or reducing the public health sensitive nutrients. I just wanted here, because my topic is about the technology part of things, what are the solutions that are available out there when you want to reduce something like salt, and it can look similar when it comes to other nutrients. So here you have, for example, for sodium, you can of course do a plain salt reduction. Consumers, however, need to make sure that they do adapt it, because the choice out there is amazing. And if they taste your food, they don't like it, they can have 10 other products on the shelf that they can take instead of the one that you reduced. So I think we have to take the consumer on the journey with that. Then you can also think about sodium redistribution, the food matrix. Here is something, like you can take particles. In that case, it's an example. I don't have the details here because interest of time. But there is a cornmeal, and you can put the sodium around that cornmeal particles, which you put underneath the dough. And hence, you need less sodium because the perception of the sodium is actually quite direct, and you can, as such, also maximize the salt release by reducing the overall content. And then, of course, we can replace salt, for example, by potassium chloride, always understanding the technological and technical aspects that relates with, as well as the acceptance in terms of taste, etc. And then there is also taste compensation by using herbs, spices, etc. that actually gives you the taste experience that you are expecting. You need to have a long breath, and that was, I think, pointed out. This cannot be changed really overnight unless there is really a policy that would just ban the whole food provided actually from the marketplace. But otherwise, it takes a long time. In the case of our company, we have started to make a mandatory policy on sodium reduction back in 2005, and we have taken cycles here to actually move gradually forward with the aim actually to meet the WHO target, which is set out for the 2,000 milligram a day by 2025. Going back a little bit on technology on the larger side of things, I needed to go across the ocean. I tried a little bit with my Trends to Stay also because it's a European event here. I wanted to tap into a culture which is quite ahead in terms of the technical use. So in China, there is almost no monetary transaction taking place anymore with bills. So they just pay everything online with their mobile phone. People don't have wallets. I mean, they have their phone. So what this helps us, what is providing as an opportunity is that everybody has mobile phones, everybody uses it. We took the opportunity to collaborate actually with a local provider of mobile phones to actually, work on a personal dietary recommendation, but actually leaning and building on the Chinese dietary recommendations. So what we do see here is actually the pagoda. So that is actually the dietary recommendations from the Chinese Nutritional Society. And what we have done is actually to translate that into the 12 food groups actually in a digital format. And then we did analyze also the Chinese Health and Nutrition Survey, which is based on 24-hour recall data, with, of course, the limited, with the errors that come with that, but provided that that is the data that is at hand and that you can use. And we did evaluate the dietary diversity and the relative risk of specific nutrient inequalities, and then we kind of optimized that by taking also portion sizes into account into what that would look like in terms of the potential risks that you would have. And then eventually, you can have a score. Interesting to mention that the items and tools, which is mainly addressing elderly people because they often fall off in terms of what they eat and due to their changes in their social life, etc., and also their possibility to probably cook their own meals, etc., and give them at hand a tool that helps them to orient where are your major pitfalls and to help address that. The company also that provides the digital assets also has tracking tools for exercise, for blood pressure, etc. So you can actually even combine that. So the next step of this is actually now that there are quite a lot of people there is to see, does it really drive behavior change, and what is the impact that you can create with that. So that brings me to the conclusions. I think that technological innovations and the demographic trends, I think I showed some evidence that they do really tremendously influence the food demand. Nutrition, health, and wellness has, on the positive side, become an important driver for consumers' food choices. And they do provide opportunities to improve the diets to within recommended intakes. And there are watch-outs, of course, to be considered. Given the huge influence of social media as information source, of course, there is a really strong need to guide consumers to reliable nutrition and health information. And definitely I didn't have talked about who should be actually, what should the governance be there, but definitely there needs to be a large body of different stakeholders, including academia, including policymakers, that really need to take that up and do the educational bit here, and provide information that is helpful. And then I think it was mentioned previously, and I think I would just like to echo that, we need a holistic and multi-stakeholder approach as part of the larger health and wellness ecosystem that can support healthier diets. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Petra. A very stimulating presentation. We probably have time for just one question before going to the panel discussion. So a question from the audience? Yes.
Thank you for your speech. And I want to know what Nestlé is doing about reducing sugars, because there is a lot of sugar, not only in sweets, ice creams, but also in salted products. For instance, yesterday I see pesto buitoni, and in one serving there is a tablespoon of added sugar. What are you doing for reducing sugar?
Yeah, there is, that wasn't the topic of the talk, but I'm happy to answer, and we have quite a substantial communication transparently available on the internet for that as well. But in terms of sugar reduction, it looks similar to what we do for sodium. We have a policy in place for sugar reduction. We have to do it gradually, and we actually work here to make sure that we can reduce sugar using the different technologies that are available, and again, providing also that there is consumer acceptance coming with that. But I'm happy to orient you to more details on that if you want to.
Okay, thank you very much. Petra, could I ask all our speakers this morning to return to the stage, please, and we'll take some further questions. Okay, so because we had limited time for discussion earlier, and I have a number of questions submitted via the app, I'm sort of going to wind back a little and go back to the opening sugar discussion, and then work our way through the morning. Okay, so we had a submitted question saying, regarding sugar intake, results of observational studies may be biased due to low participation rates of those with low socioeconomic status. Can you comment on that and suggest how to tackle this in the interpretation of studies? And there was another related question, if you'll just bear with me, asking did studies correlate obesity with education and social class or socioeconomic status both in US and Europe? So does anybody want to answer?
So I'll just tackle that since we did the review of the prospective cohorts. So I think residual confounding is always an issue. I think a lot of people working with the prospective cohorts, Darius among them, have done a great job, I think, at getting at a lot of that confounding and getting better adjustments in place. But because of that, we can infer causality, we know that, but we can look at things like dose response and other factors which we might downgrade as well, such as inconsistency or imprecision, publication bias, risk of bias in terms of the estimates. So one of the things we do look at is something called indirectness as part of grade, which really gets at, is this representative of the population of interest? So if we have a systematic review with very few prospective cohort studies, maybe just has the nurses and the health professionals, we might argue that this may not be extrapolatable to all populations, so we may downgrade for indirectness. But if we have that, and we have EPIC, we have a number of others, Jacksonville Heart, others throughout the United States and Asia, then we can be a little more confident in making some of those extrapolations. So we do consider that. We look for the maximally adjusted models, so those tend to include socioeconomic status and educational attainment, but we do know that that is an important confounder. And if we take something like sugar-sweetened beverages, for example, we know high consumers, they eat more calories, they smoke more, exercise less. There's a lot of confounders, just like high fish eaters do everything right. So I think the issue of confounding is important, and that we would want the most adjusted models.
Okay. And in terms of, I think it's well known that there is association between socioeconomic status and level of obesity.
And diabetes, yeah, and in fact the relative risks are stronger. But then I think then you want to go into something like the global burden of disease, which takes account of the prevalence of exposure, which is really important, and not just interpreting relative risks in isolation. And when you do that, I mean, I think it's been shown by a couple speakers, dietary factors are still the most important. And then we can get at, well, which ones are the priorities and which ones aren't, which I think was part of the presentations we saw.
Yep. Okay. Another question, are there well-designed studies linking, I think it's a preference for sweetness with obesity?
Well, I mean, is there any relationship between sweetness and obesity? Are the acoustics very bad?
Sorry,
I'm slightly deaf, I'm afraid. There's suggestive evidence that the sweeter a product, I mean, if you read the Moss book, the reporter from New York who did the thing, salt, whatever it is, he says that the food industry are aiming for this magic mixture of salt, sugar, and fat that everyone's going to adore, a bit like a rat, or something that's going to eat far more of it. I mean, the actual evidence for that is zero, but I think there is a suggestion that if something's got the right taste characteristics, people do seem to get addicted to it, and they do eat more of it, probably. But I mean, it doesn't matter to me. I'd only stress one point. We're faced by a crisis now in obesity and type 2 diabetes, as well as blood pressure and cholesterol, which tend to be forgotten about. And we have to do something now. It's completely wrong to go on arguing about what we should do, whether to study X or Y. Let's get on with doing something. I mean, Nestle are giving these very slow reductions in salt and sugar. Actually, in the UK, they've reduced their cereals by 40%. Now, why haven't they done that worldwide? Why hasn't Unilever reduced their salt, which they've done in the UK? You can see lots of examples like that. Why are they doing it in Chile, but not in the United States? It is a bit mad, and we've got to get the food industry to act responsibly. And I agree that Nestle are more responsible than other companies, but it's just using an example that we need to move now. We can move on salt tomorrow. We know how to do it. We can do it. We can move on sugar, and we can move on fat. And I disagree with Darius to some extent that we need to get those unhealthy products either off the market, which we can't do, or make them more healthy. And we need to get on with it.
Thank you. Any other panel member want to comment? Okay. So moving on to some other questions about labelling, food labelling. So what do you think about front-of-pack labels that make a global judgment of a food product on the basis of a selection of nutrients? And then also some specific comments about the Nutri-Score in France. Yeah.
So we've reviewed this for research, and we have a couple of papers on this, and we're also in discussions with some specific research projects to look at this. And I don't think I think many of the current nutrient profiling systems have problems and challenges. And so, some of them are still in some ways reasonable, and I think the ones, the Australia, New Zealand one is of the most popular ones, is probably one of the better ones. I think what they generally are missing is the good. They're missing the good. And I think the other problem that they're generally missing is the balance of healthy fats versus unhealthy fats, and the balance of refined starch versus sugar. So to me, those are two of the biggest omissions, is there's not enough focus on good ingredients, especially food types, food ingredients, and there's not enough, the three things, there's not enough focus on good healthy food ingredients, there's not enough focus on healthy fats, and there's not enough focus on refined starch. And so if I was going to create a nutrient profiling, simple front of pack, to me the three things I would put on it would be the ratio of unsaturated fat to saturated fat, the ratio, because it's really the relative amounts that matter, the ratio of total carbohydrate to fiber or refined starch to whole grain, because it's really, you have to not just think about sugar but refined starch, and sodium. I think those would be the three things. I wouldn't put calories, I wouldn't put fat, I wouldn't put saturated fat by itself. The scoring system that I think is actually the best one is NutriSavings. NutriSavings is a scoring system in the United States. It's used by worksite wellness companies. It's used by life insurance companies. It's used by health insurance companies. About 1.5 million Americans currently have theoretical access to it through this private company, but it hasn't been published on. And we actually have a paper that we've submitted looking at this scoring system. So I think this NutriSaving scoring system is the best one that I've seen. I think that nutrient profiling is a reasonable approach and should be done, but many of the current systems are focused on kind of outdated nutrient targets.
Okay.
I just wanted to add to that. I think there are a lot of pitfalls. And I mean, to use the example of smoking that Dariush mentioned, I think another reason that nutrition is not smoking is that any displacement or replacement behavior for smoking is better than smoking. So anything is better. Anything in nutrition isn't necessarily better, and we better have an evidence-based approach to ensuring that the ingredients and the nutrients, especially with macronutrients, because you're going to have to replace one with the other, that we're making that substitution wisely and we're actually getting a healthier product. Because the consumer is going to believe it's healthier when they see the label. And I think refined starches have gotten far too much of a free pass, and our data shows very clearly that the sugars in refined starches behave very similarly. There's no advantage to replacement of sugars with refined starches.
I just want to add the Chinese pagoda. I hadn't seen that before. I don't know if people saw the Chinese pagoda, but it looks exactly like the U.S. dietary pyramid from like 30 years ago, which has been roundly debunked, right? Grains and rice was at the bottom. Nuts and legumes and oils were, without distinguishing healthy oils or unhealthy oils, were at the very, very top. I mean, sort of really sad that here we are 30 years later and China put out a guideline that looks like the guidelines from the U.S. from 30 years ago. So.
Can I just say, I mean, it's very important to have what's in your food and properly labelled, and signpost labelling is the obvious. Traffic lights, people prefer that, and all the consumers. But that isn't going to change the world. I mean, the idea that a busy housewife with 2 children go into a supermarket and start choosing a product, bread with less salt in, crisps with less salt in, less fat, I mean, it's completely bonkers. No one can do that. And the label isn't used like that. So it isn't going to solve the crisis that we have. So I think we need to think of other strategies, and labelling is a necessity, but it's not that important in public health because it's not going to change consumption. How could it?
Okay, thank you. Following on then, and it's this definition of a healthy and unhealthy food. One of the questions from the audience, Action on Sugar, is suggesting subsidies for healthy foods. What would be your definition of a healthy food?
Their criteria, the Oxford criteria, which I can't quite remember, clearly decide. I mean, obviously you've got to have a compendium of what salt, sugar, fat, and what else do you think are important, fibre, and come up with some. There are criteria for that make the food unhealthy or not. Now, the restrictions on advertising in the UK, which are getting pretty severe, and they will be banned, is now getting food companies to start saying we're demonising food, like your All Brand. There was a big article in the paper yesterday about All Brand being a healthy food, and therefore it shouldn't be demonised because it would be restricted on its advertising. But it's very high, as we said, in sugar and salt, so it is unhealthy. So I think a lot of perception about foods, that people think a food is healthy because it's got a lot of fibre in it. It's not healthy, it's got a lot of salt and sugar in it. So I think there will always be arguments on the dividing line between healthy and unhealthy. But clearly we know the majority of unhealthy foods are pretty clear-cut. But I'm not going to get into a specific argument about whether one food's unhealthy or another isn't, because you get down
So I think we have to actually define it so that it can be implemented. And the reason I know about NutriSavings that I mentioned is we at Tufts, we partner with John Hancock Life Insurance. John Hancock is, people probably don't know in Europe, but is one of the most established life insurance companies in the United States, 150 years old. They've launched a program called John Hancock Vitality in partnership with South Africa Vitality that pays their life insurance clients for purchasing healthier foods. John Hancock pays $50 a month to their life insurance clients to buy healthier foods because they said if we pay $600 a year, they have 1.8 million life insurance clients that could potentially get this. If we pay $600 per year for them to buy healthier food, they live longer and we make more money. So they are putting a dollar value on it. And the NutriSaving scoring system, all foods that score above 70 out of 1 to 100 get the subsidy. And so they have a clear definition. And what I think is good about the scoring system for NutriSavings, as I mentioned, they include a range of healthful nutrients. So unsaturated fats get credit and many other things get credit. They include the ingredients list too, and so you need to look at the ingredients. And then I think probably most crucially, they have different range limits for different foods. And so produce, can't get too low of a score. Of course, if you have a sweetened, salted fruit or vegetable, it might get a lower score, but it still can't get too low of a score. Bread or desserts or meats can't get too high of a score. So I think we have to define it, and I think defining it by nutrient profiling that's comprehensive, by the ingredients list, and by having ranges, right? Fruits and vegetables should be high. Nuts should be high, and so on. So I think that there are ways to do it, and I think we have to argue and get into the details, because if we want to actually do something in policy, companies are going to say, how do I get my food to have a higher score so it can be subsidized? And as a simple rule, as a simple start, we could just subsidize fruits and vegetables and nuts, right? And in the United States, there's a $100 million program, which sounds like a lot of money, but $100 million isn't a lot, to subsidize fruits and vegetables for people on food stamps, on SNAP. So they have a definition. They have a definition of what's a fruit. They have a definition of what's a vegetable. You can do it with the UPC codes, and they subsidize it. So it can be done, and it's not that complicated, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to add something, too, just to pull on the example that Graham offered about all bran. I think still it's better to consume the all bran than the cornflakes or the Special K that Darish had up there. It still has 12 to 13 grams of fiber.
They're both
yeah.
unhealthy. I mean,
well,
cornflakes are seriously unhealthy. All bran is unhealthy.
But the point is, I think people are not having enough of the fruit.
Wheat, which has no added salt, no sugar, and is made from whole grain, is a healthy cereal, right? So, I mean, it's a matter of degree, but in people's mind is the fact that all bran is healthy, because Kellogg's have done an incredible job in the last 50 years in making it seem healthy, when in fact it's not, in my view. A cereal that has a lot of salt and a lot of sugar in can in no way, just because it's got bran in, make it healthy, whereas shredded wheat is healthy, right? Because it's got no added salt, no added sugar, and it's whole grain. So how do you argue against that?
So I'm not going to argue against that. I think the industry should be moving more toward that. But the point is we have to reach that balance, which I think was touched upon in terms of palatability. We want consumers to have more whole grains, more high-fiber foods. I would argue more of the viscous fibers from oats and barley and psyllium. So if we're going to do that, we have to make sure we don't tie the hand behind the back so tightly that we can't get the consumer to make those changes. And I take the example also of yogurt, sweetened versus unsweetened. In the prospective cohorts, there's really no difference in terms of weight and diabetes where we have that data. So I think, we want people to consume yogurt. Certainly an unsweetened yogurt is better, maybe adding fruit to it, but we still, I think, have to leverage where we can the fat, sugar, and salt to get those healthy foods as opposed to the nutrients.
I'm going to interrupt the two of you who could keep debating for some time. Philip, you want to add something?
Yes, maybe I am alone of this position, but I don't like healthy and unhealthy. In fact, obviously, companies have to improve food, but in fact, I think that there is no unhealthy or healthy food, but unhealthy way to consume in terms of too much and in terms of too less also. And that implies, in addition, a huge educational role to make sure that people, when they eat with their choices and education. And the most priority is to educate to amounts of everything. And in this way, I am maybe more optimistic than Darius, because in comparison with car, in fact, I am sure that for food, education should be in the middle. And don't forget that healthy unhealthy has proved its limit, because the height of lipids during 50 years led to increased obesity. Okay, so we are lucky with since 11,000 years of agriculture to have everything everywhere, maybe too much, but don't forget that we are lucky to have plenty of things. Just be more clever and more educated to choose the good amounts.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to interrupt my perusal of the questions submitted from the app to see, are there any burning questions from the audience? Yes.
I have just one question. We talked about the intermediate actions we can take in order to improve our diet, like sugar reduction, salt reduction, and the influence on the potentially on taste. And I see there's a lot of question about the taste, and it will lead probably to the rejection of food by consumers. But my question would be that whether these are immediate actions, whether we didn't touch a topic about like longer term actions, like there are some studies showing that the very early nutrition shapes our habits and taste preferences in the later life. Can we have a little bit discussion about this topic, if there's any action necessary after weaning toddlers?
So I think, first I agree with some of the earlier comments that I don't think we need to get rid of sweetness in foods. If you have a very healthy food and you add a little bit of sweetness to it, that's a fruit. That's what a fruit is. It's a healthy food that's sweet. So it's okay to make a packaged or processed food. If it's very healthy and has a little bit of sweet in it, that's great. That's what we should be eating. That's natural. I think that there's a lot of interest and a lot of enthusiasm about early life exposures and eating. I think the rigorous evidence to know how important that is, as opposed to addressing the whole food supply, is still unclear. I think addressing kids is really important because politically it has traction, and so we can talk about choice for adults, but if you have an obesity epidemic in 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, we know it's not about choice, right? It's about the system. The system is broken. When we have an obesity epidemic in kids under 5, the system is broken. So I think kids are very important for policy action. We just published a paper recently looking at what the impact would be of giving free fruits and vegetables to all school children in the United States, from elementary school through to high school. And we looked at how early life diets may translate to adulthood and how that may affect weight, how that may affect cardiovascular disease, and so forth. And actually what we found is the effects on weight would be pretty small, almost very difficult to measure. The long-term effects on cardiovascular disease would be seen because some of the fruits and vegetables consumed in schools would translate into habits later in life that would then reduce cardiovascular disease. So I think it's important. But that's one of the first papers that I know of that actually tried to quantify the effect and how much is translated. If you did a cost analysis of that, I don't know that it would be cost effective to be giving free fruits and vegetables to all children to have a small effect in adulthood. So personally, I think it's promising. It's very interesting. We need more research. It's clearly a policy lever to focus on kids because people understand that kids need to be protected. But the actual rigorous quantitative evidence that focusing on kids as opposed to everybody is more important, I think is actually limited.
I don't disagree. If you look worldwide, I mean, there aren't enough fruit and vegetables being grown to actually supply the world with fruit and vegetables. So you have a lack of supply. In terms of the salt receptors and sugar receptors, so that's more complicated, sugar receptor, you adapt. If you eat less salt, it takes about 6 weeks for the salt taste receptors to adapt and become more sensitive. And similarly for sugar, although it's more complicated in how it actually works. So you can easily get off salt. And you see that in the UK. We've had about a 30 to 40% reduction in the salt in products. And people haven't noticed. There's been no rejection of the foods. The same foods are still marketed. Salt intake has fallen in the UK. The problem is when we come to Italy, the food is incredibly salty. And that is the only problem of it, that other countries haven't done the same. I'm sure you can do the same with sugar, although we don't as yet have that experience in the UK. We will, in the next 10 years, have a similar experience in the UK with the sweetness coming down in all products. And that actually, one of the things I notice now is that although some companies make fruits with more sugar and they actually genetically modify them to get more sugar, actually fruit and vegetables don't taste nearly as sweet to me as they did when I was a child. And that's because the sugar's gone up in everything else. So you actually, children, if you give them a fruit, don't find it sweet enough because they're so used to these very high sugar drinks. And I think that's another reason to get the sugar down, because fruits will then become more attractive because they will be found to be very sweet. So I think there may be hidden benefits of reducing sugar in foods in terms of people wanting to eat more fruit and vegetables. There's no doubt children don't particularly like fruit and vegetables. They have to be sold to them. And of course, they're not marketed. I mean, the hidden elephant in this room is, look, this food industry is spending billions of dollars promoting unhealthy food. We have a few million in public health money to counter that. It doesn't work. They're always going to win. And we've got to stop them marketing and advertising this unhealthy food. I think that's something we haven't really discussed in this session so far.
Okay.
I just would like to add a comment on that in terms of the interests of the industry also to establish healthy eating habits. There is also industry associations, and one of the biggest is actually Consumer Goods Forum, which is an industry association that has across the globe 400 companies, and it's the only one actually that brings food manufacturers and retailers together. And there is a very fair understanding that actually, if you want to build a sustainable business over time, you better make sure you have consumers that can still buy because they are not passed away and, by non-communicable diseases. So there is a clear understanding of this by the industry, and there are actually programs that we're trying also to understand the mechanisms of that, like by these public-private partnerships, by multiple industry partners doing together, using the floor stores, for education, which is in line with policies, which are actually engaging to the people that come there. So there is movement as well into this direction. But I think it's complex, as we have seen, I think, throughout the whole morning in all the presentations. And I guess we really need to pull all the stakeholders together at the table to understand who is playing which role and how can we best contribute. Because by just, like finger pointing, you doing all that, so then I don't do that, I think this doesn't really help the solution. So I like the pragmatism of, like moving, and I guess there is a lot of pragmatism also out there from many other people in trying to address, and there is a fly that likes that space apparently here. So I would just call out again for the need for these joint actions and collective actions.
Thank you. So we are running short of time. My co-chair has allowed me to accept one more question. So John, from the audience. Yes.
Thank you very much. John Mathers, Newcastle University. Dr. Legrand made a strong case that not all saturated fatty acids should be treated in the same way, and singled out the C16 as the baddie in all the saturated fatty acids. So if your argument is that we should reduce C16 but not worry about all the others, are there any practical ways of doing that in relation to food supply?
So you agree, what I said is a question of amount. Palmitic acid is not a bad guy by itself. I have no real response, but I think that proving it links with cardiovascular disease has been only oriented towards its exogenous intake. My talk said, don't forget that it's also an endogenous synthesis by the excess of glucose, fructose, and alcohol. So I am in fundamental sciences, so I have no issues, no solution easy to propose. But it comes back to the idea of a marker, but a metabolic marker, not a marker from pharmaceutical links, or a metabolic marker saying too much. Too much what? Too much maybe exogenous source, too much alcohol, too much glucose. So if I say too much, I am secure, I just say too much energy. And maybe I am somewhat different opinion with Darius again. No, on this point, I think I've grown with thermodynamic sciences as a biochemist, and however, energy does not make every explanation for obesity, but it maintains at the very center of that. That means palmitic acid is an excess of energy as compared to the expenditure. So maybe eat less or move more, but eat whatever you want maybe.
One take-home message that I would give, which has been mentioned a couple times, is that if we're going to we shouldn't focus on sugar without focusing on starch. If you take away soda, there's much more starch in the food supply. I mean, even with soda, there's much more refined starch in the food supply than sugar. And as was mentioned, the major source of endogenous 16-0 is starch and sugar being synthesized to 16-0 in the circulation, not dietary 16-0. And 16-0 in tissues is toxic. It's not a good thing to have in tissues, and it's produced by the liver, by starch and excess starch and sugar. So I think that industry is focused on sugar. Focusing on sugar without focusing on starch, I think, is a big mistake. So.
Listen.
But I just want to make one point about LDL cholesterol. We have 3 different ways of lowering LDL cholesterol with drugs. They all show the same reduction in cardiovascular disease for a given LDL reduction. Therefore, if we reduce saturated fat intake, it causes a fall in LDL. It's extremely likely to reduce cardiovascular disease. And I think that's a pretty strong argument against these cohort studies that are incredibly weak in assessing fat intake, etc., and then claiming there's no relationship between saturated fat and coronary heart disease. And I think they're wrong, but it's difficult to prove it.
Listen, thank you. I think we could probably debate for quite some time, but I'd like to thank the experts, first of all, for their excellent presentations and then giving their time so openly in terms of answering the questions. Thank you to the audience for submitting some excellent questions. I'd encourage you to corner our panel, perhaps over lunch, if we didn't manage to get round to your question. In the meantime, thank you very much. So I just want to hand over to Valeria, my co-chair, just to wrap up the session.
Sorry, bear with me a few minutes more. So first of all, I will start with a remark. We've heard a lot of discussion about policy, implementation, recommendations, measures, action, and so on. All this is fine, and we're very happy to have this discussion together with the scientific discussion as well. But just to remind you that all that part on the policy, decision, recommendations is not with EFSA. We are not in charge of that job. However, again, we are very happy to have the discussion, and hopefully those who have to do that were present in the room, and they will get the message across, and we were happy to intermediate the transfer of that message to the risk managers and decision makers. I'm very grateful to all of you for the great discussion and the great questions you had. Thank you also to the audience for their participation through the questions sent through the app. Just let me to remind a very few key points that I picked up from the discussion. From the first debate, we noted that despite some different points of view between the two speakers, both of them highlighted that the adverse effects on sugars are mediated through excess of calories. With regard to the saturated fatty acids, both speakers agreed that different saturated fatty acids have different metabolic effects, but evidence whether they also have different health effects and whether such differences could and should impact dietary recommendations is a bit still controversial. A strong message we've got was stop looking at single nutrients, look at the whole diet, because dietary patterns and diet quality have a stronger impact on health than any dietary component, and they represent the best opportunity for successful intervention. Then we picked up also some points regarding research in nutrition, and in some presentations was a clear message to focus on large RCTs, on trials on dietary patterns and consumer research, but also do not forget about physiology, was Professor Legrand specifically saying. There might be cultural differences in the role food plays in consumers' life, but health is a dominant factor in food choice, and therefore consumer behaviors toward healthier foods and diet, towards meeting dietary recommendation, need to be considered in food reformulation and in food innovation. We've got repeated calls, and especially in the last intervention and in the in the panel discussion, a call to those who can make the difference to join the efforts, food industry, science, policymakers, consumers, to act toward implementing measures and behaviors that will support healthy dietary patterns. I'm sure you have retained many other messages, and I'm pretty sure you will already think about when picking up your food during the lunch break. But with this, I would like to conclude and to first thank to our speakers for their time and their excellent contribution. I also want to thank warmly to Jane for an excellent running of the session and the debate. To also thank my colleagues, Andrea and Silvia, who were there, and they put a lot of passion and effort in organizing this session. And of course, to all of you for being a participative audience, and also to those who followed through webcasting by taking the time to be with us. So enjoy the rest of the conference, embrace this opportunity to network with others, and stay in touch with EFSA. Thank you very much.